Okay. Well, welcome everybody. This is Soul Talk for March, and I am absolutely delighted that I have Alli MacKenzie back with me. Just so you know, I've invited her, and she's accepted to be a more regular participant or guest or co-host on this conversation. And I think it's a really I'm going to read into this, Alli. I think it's a really beautiful pairing because I tend to think in very big picture stuff. And Alli's one of those people in my world that kind of draws me back down to like, okay, and how does this apply to like everyday stuff? And it's a great conversation to have. And I think we'll wind up having this in this conversation today because I think it gives you a little bit more of a sense of who we are and how we're putting all of this together in our own world. So if you are live with us on Zoom, welcome. If you are watching on the replay or via YouTube, welcome. Alli, do you want to say hi to everybody?
Hi. Hello. It's so lovely to be back. And I'm gonna just add to what you said, Trish. I think it's nice when you find people who can understand your lingo. And I feel like you are that person for me where, I'll be like, hey, yada yada yada, and you're like, absolutely, yes, I'm
Mhm.
feeling that too. And so I love that we can bounce off of
Yeah.
each other, and then together also, like you say, have that big picture, but then also be able to narrow it into the human experience. So that's why I love our conversation so much.
Yeah. And whatever Ali just said, all of those things are absolutely true. It is a very mutual conversation back and forth. I'm bouncing things back to her. Hey, have you seen this? And she'll be like, "Oh, yes, I have." And so, I think we keep ourselves and each other grounded in really interesting, cool ways. So, one of the things that we were talking about, everybody, as Ali and I were putting this conversation together and thinking about how we wanted to approach this was, first of all, if you didn't watch January Soul Talk, that might be an interesting place to start because I retracked my steps through Soul Align 2025, and Ali shared some pieces from the Akashic Records. And I think it's a really interesting place to start because it is that big picture. And I love this idea that we're coming back a couple of months later now to have something that's going to maybe feel like a more practical conversation about, okay, all of this stuff is happening, and maybe we buy into it, maybe we don't, right? Depending on where we are in the spiritual context of things. But I like the idea that we've got this yin and yang now between
Mhm.
the big picture and the practical everyday pieces. And so for my part in this, if you're not familiar with who I am the New Age Tour Guide podcast. I'm Trish Murray, and I am a brand steward to what I will sometimes refer to as soulpreneurs, people who are in the entrepreneurial world and really looking for a way to balance this idea of spirituality and strategy in the context of what they're doing. And I run a group on Telegram, building a community on Telegram for sovereign souls. And so we'll probably talk a little bit about that. So, Ali, maybe just a quick little intro for people who may not be familiar with you.
For sure. Yeah, I would say I really serve or cater to the spiritually curious. So those who are feeling like, okay, I know maybe I have a soul or maybe I am a soul, depending on, your state of consciousness in the moment. But, those who are really ready to go a little bit deeper. And so in that, it's really about not only connecting to the soul level self, but then also realizing that, okay, maybe I do actually have more potential than I initially had maybe given myself credit for. So it's about curiously exploring that potential so that you can really start to live authentically and live abundantly. And so I do that through, a few different means. So hypnotherapy, Akashic Records, soul coaching, intuitive Reiki therapy. I also teach and train those who want to become Reiki practitioners centers or to read the Akashic records. So it's really, very much linked to your work in terms of that sovereignty, Trish. It's like, how do we anchor into who we really are so that we can then live in that and be an expression of it?
Yeah. Yeah. And as much as I love the big picture, it really does come down to sort of boots on the ground. How do I walk this on a daily basis? How do I live this out loud? How do we as individuals, how does Alli? And I think that's where the conversation is really going to go, because when we were talking about this back and forth in texts, one of the things that Alli came back and was saying, like, hey, I think this would be really interesting um, to talk about this idea that we get to choose. We get to decide how we want to put this life together and how we want to see these things unfold. And I think that's an interesting starting place, because I think that was probably for me one of the big aha moments was,
Mhm.
like, I know we hear it. I know we see all these great, beautiful memes, and we're scrolling and we see all these people talking about this, but I don't think that until it really like landed for me that no, I am a sovereign soul. I
Mhm.
have complete sovereignty at a soul level about how I want to approach this. Um, and so, Alli came up was saying, like, in terms of what does that look like? Well, it could be, when did we decide that we were going to take Mondays off? And, what were sort of some of the steps that led us to believe that that was right for us, that that was going to be a good alignment for us? Um, Redefining what life could look like is the goal of this conversation. And I would like to start with that, if I could, Alli, just talking about this has been a 12-year process for me. I really, well, 13 now, because we're into 2025. Um, I really kind of consider 2012 as to be that pivot year, that real turning point year for me.
Mhm.
So much started to change, and it was it coincided with something in my numerology, which I've been talking a little bit about on Instagram and definitely in Telegram, about these pivot points, these 4 pivot points in numerology, and that one of those pivot points for me carried a theme of freedom and liberty. Freedom and
Mhm.
liberty. And I didn't know this until like many years after 2012, but freedom and liberty. Like, I really look back on so many of the choices that I made. And I was like, oh, that's exactly what I was looking for, was freedom and liberty. And the other side of this for me was when I really started to study into human design, and I kind of started to unpack one piece in particular, which is the will center in human design. I have an open will, and one of the things that comes along with that is a really strong and deep drive to do life on your own terms.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so it was, if you want to think of it in terms of like, it was inevitable that I was going to kind of go down this path of fucking around with all kinds of things in order to find out my favorite language, fucking around to find out what is going to work for me. And I'm not going to say that I've got it all figured out, but there are some things that are kind of non-negotiables for me now. And so
Mhm.
we'll talk a little bit about that. So maybe Alli, let's jump over to you. And how have you, like, where did it kind of start for you?
Yeah, I think for myself, I talk a lot about, the birth of our son being kind of like my wake up call and having that moment of like, what the fuck am I doing? Am I supposed to be doing this? Like, how did we get here? And so for me, I would say 2018 is definitely when life started to take a different direction for me. And if anything, I often say that's when I feel like I really started living, or maybe gave my permission or myself permission to start living on my own terms. And I think that's one of the interesting pieces to this whole energy of polarity, right? Is that, yes, there's these opposing pieces, excuse me, these opposing pieces to life, but they're all very interconnected. And that often they're very complementary, and I will always say, well, as humans, if we only ever lived, I mean, I know we're working to getting to this point, but at this point with our collective consciousness, like if we only ever lived in a state of love and bliss and joy, I don't know if we would really truly appreciate it for what it is. And that's why often we need to have some of the struggles or the challenges to come to appreciate the light, but to also understand that the light has always been within us. It's not this thing that we need to find outside of us. And so it's kind of like the lotus, right? It's like
Yeah.
growing through the mud and it's going through these experiences to then figure out, holy fuck, this is who I am. Now I get to blossom. And so for those who are listening, if they're like, okay, we talk about this whole age of Aquarius and authenticity and choosing to step into that. And so, if you're listening going, oh God, well, like I'm not living authentically at all. Well, here's the thing, living in the age of polarity means, well, if you are living inauthentically, you also have the choice to choose to live authentically because both exist. So it doesn't mean that you're stuck in one realm over the other and that you're allowed to change. You get to change your mind. And I think a lot of us get really stuck in this box of, well, this is how people view me, or this is how people know me, or this is how I have been showing up. So what's going to happen if I start to change what that is or who I am? And then there's often this piece that goes, well, can I give myself permission to do that? And if so, am I going to be okay with all the moving parts that happen because of it? Because there is going to be a ripple effect that comes with that. And so, for myself in 2018, I think it was this opening of perspective that really just said, okay, whose terms have I been living on? Like I've been doing these things. Yeah, I've accomplished some pretty cool stuff, but was any of it because I really wanted to from my heart center, or is it because I've been programmed to show up that way? And so, as we start to talk about some of these rituals and routines and how to ground into who we are, I mean, I think there's a whole bunch of different sort of steps or moving pieces to this as well, which I know we'll get into today. But I think a lot of it just starts with, can you give yourself the permission to choose something different, or have you been waiting for somebody else to give that to you?
Oh boy. Where do I even start with that? Like, there's so many things I could go back to with that because I think there is that permission piece. I know that, there was probably a point where if you had said to me, Trish, are you giving yourself permission to chase freedom and liberty? Are you giving yourself permission to live on your own terms? I would have been like, yeah, totally. No,
Right?
no, I wasn't.
From an
No, I
unconscious
wasn't.
perspective.
Yeah, that in and of itself would have been a like, okay, it's time to start getting comfortable or uncomfortably comfortable with being honest with myself. It doesn't have to go outside. This isn't about, showing up on social media and having the open, authentic conversation until maybe you're ready for that. Maybe you want to do that. I think that just having the internal conversation about like, okay, why am I doing this? Is this really for me or is this really for somebody else or is this really because this is, this is the prototype, let's say that's been put out there for everybody to look at and everybody to say, "Oh yeah, how am I doing according to the, universal benchmark and am I successful? Of course I am
The
because
social
everybody else is."
standards.
Right? So, I mean, I hear that probably from maybe a different perspective because I didn't have kids in this incarnation. But I spent a lot of time on the other side, which some of our listeners and viewers might be able to relate to, is chasing the the chasing my way up the ladder, right? Up the
Mhm,
corporate
mhm.
ladder. And, some of it wasn't even really all that conscious. It was just stuff it just kind of kept landing in my lap. And I don't want to say that it came easily because I worked way too much and way too hard. But the advancement came without me really consciously considering if that's what I was looking for.
Mhm.
And so, I've sat in the suite, right? And I have, been a part of a board of directors for a company that I was a part owner in. And, I've done all of those things, and I did really get to a place of like, okay, is this is this it? Is this is this going to be like the next 20 years? And that's why I say 2012 for me was a real turning point, because I think that I really started to ask different questions. And so the authentic piece is so interesting to me, because I do believe that, whatever else we declare this quote new age to be all about, I think authenticity is going to be a really big one, because that's part of what Aquarius, I think, is all about, is us showing up as our unique individual reflections of the divine within the collective. Within the
Mhm.
collective, it's not this is an ego, this is an ego driven, look at me. It's just being so centered and grounded in the fact that we are each unique individuals, and we need to celebrate that and lean into what that looks like, and bring that out into the collective, and create part of the tapestry. So um so let's pause here, because we talked about deprogramming.
Yeah.
That's a rabbit hole. That is a rabbit hole all on its own, and we might have to come back on that one, Alli,
Mhm.
because I do want to be mindful and conscientious about allowing this to be a conversation that unfolds, and is maybe what people are have capacity for. But I
Of
do
course.
want to maybe focus more on this idea of capacity. How do we start to create that capacity for ourselves to go exploring and do a little bit of fucking around, and not feel the fear that comes up around, because I think fear is a really big thing in our
Oh,
world
huge.
right now. And if you're
Mhm.
watching this on the replay, we're recording this in March of 2025. I think fear has been with us for a long time, but it got amped up, say, I don't know, like maybe March of 2020, somewhere around there, somewhere around
Give
that
or
time
take.
frame. And we've been like the duck on water. Like, we're just, as a collective,
Yeah.
we're we're doing everything that we can to be able to be feel a sense of equilibrium. So let's stop kind of rambling and talk about the rituals, the practical stuff. And let's go with you first. What are some of the things that you've been doing over the last, say, 5 to 6, 7 years, progressively, step by step,
Yeah.
that have helped you create capacity?
Well, I think it's interesting when we talk about this, and I almost like to refer to it as practical spirituality, making a practice of practical spirituality, because I think when we start exploring the world of spiritualism, there's so much. And I
So
think for
much.
myself, yeah, it was like, well, who do I trust? Who do I believe? Like, there's so many different ways of expressing what it means to be spiritual. And so I think, there's this act of like slowly building up our discernment. But I think initially, how did I actually apply all of this? I honestly like one of the first books that I ever read was The Spiritual Laws of Success by Deepak Chopra. And so that's just a book that's always kind of stuck with me. If I'm ever feeling kind of like lost in the abyss, I'll come back to that. But I feel like, and honestly, when I started in my whole journey, Reiki was very much at the root of me becoming who I am. And so I think what this links to though is, not everybody's going to practice Reiki and that's fine, but I think it's an act of grounding through the process of stillness. Because I think we are so bombarded energetically in this world that we're not supposed to have this much access. Like it's great that we do, and I hope that through the coming years that we're just really mindful and respectful of technology, and we're conscious of how it can support and how it could possibly impede. So I think just being able to turn down the outside noise for a bit to say, okay, what are my thoughts? Like, what am I actually thinking right now? Even just, regardless of whether or not they're true or false or whatever, but it's just, let me be in some stillness for a little bit. Let me give myself some time to retreat. And I know there's going to be people listening saying, well, I don't have time for that. I don't like, I'm busy and I'm this and that, but it's, we don't need 3 hours. Start with 3 minutes. Literally just start with 3 minutes. Maybe
Yeah.
instead of staring at your phone when you're on the toilet, give yourself 3 minutes to just sit there and literally just allow yourself to be in the present as much as you possibly can. And through that stillness, I think it's important to become the observer of what is. We're so like, most of us are not living in a present state. We're going from past to future and we're literally just bypassing the present constantly. That's all we're doing. And so by finding stillness in the present, becoming the observer of what is, we then start to bring our attention inward. Because I think, and anybody who's listened to you or I, or most people who are, preaching spirituality, they're going to say turn off the news, right? That's going to be one of the first things that they're going to invite you to do.
Yep.
But only because it's just so much noise, right? It's so there's just so much noise to that. And I think what happens is that's also part of this distraction that pulls us away from the soul level self. And so for those of us who are engulfed in the outside world, we then start putting all this energy into like, well, I need to fix this, or this really sucks, or oh my God, what's going on over here? And we are just so like, all of our soul level self is just stretched out and pulled away
Yeah. Yeah.
from source, really. And we're trying to utilize all of this energy. There's this massive energy expenditure that's going out and being pulled away. But that's not how we change the world. It's what's happening in here. And I think that's part of this 5D, this age of Aquarius, is it's like actually we change out there by changing in here. This is how we set the tone. This is how we become the beacon, or we start to become the transmitter even of the frequency that we want to be out there. So maybe I'll stop there. I think those are the two pieces, is finding stillness either through Reiki or meditation. But you can also ground obviously in nature, right? Like if you can't get outside, imagine you're outside. Just bring in all
Mm.
of your senses and really just imagine feeling the grass on your feet, or imagine, the sand between your toes. For those of us who have winter like 8 months out of the year, sometimes we have to get creative. But I'm telling you,
Sometimes.
from a mind body connection, imagining is just as powerful as a lived experience. So I think stillness through meditation, Reiki is a form of meditation, being outside in nature, those have been pivotal for me. But also just being an allowance and looking at it from the perspective of, well, even just for a moment, I'm just going to be an allowance for a moment, not I have to be an allowance all the time. It's,
Yeah.
let me just observe for this one moment. So maybe I'll just kind of pause it there for you, Trish.
Okay. Um, so what I'm going to hook into is this idea of because I think that first of all, again, if you don't know much about me, I spent about well, I stepped into the marketing industry in 1999 and stepped out in I started stepping out in 2012. And part of that stepping out was about a million rabbit holes about what what was really what's really transpiring and in the industry of media and marketing and technology and that kind of thing. And I want to be really careful about distinguishing between the industry and sort of the field of communication or information sharing and that kind of thing. I think those two things are very, very different. The industry, um, I'll be honest with you, I don't have much not much polite things to say about the industry because of the rabbit holes that I went down. And so
Hmm.
I am one of those people who is a huge proponent of turn the mainstream media off because I don't see them adding value to anybody's life, especially right now. I cut cable in 2009. I stopped watching anything. And I did kind of go cold turkey on that. And then I started to bring back in other things over time. But I do think that that is one of the things that we can do that, and we won't even realize the impact that that is going to have on us if we stop tuning into it, just like dedicating any energy to it. And I know people are going to be like, oh my God, but how will I know what's going on in the world? Trust me, you'll know because there are still going to be people in your world and in your circle who are going to tell you what they are seeing going on in the world. You're not going to probably miss out on all that much.
Yeah.
But, I also recognize that it's not all about going cold turkey. So maybe, and for some of us, I think it's harder to go cold turkey than to just say, okay, I'm only going to go in on Wednesdays and Saturday mornings and see what's going on, right? For others of us, depending on how we're wired, it might be easier for us to sort of wean ourselves off. Okay, I'm only going to go in on, and then, of course, in my world, I've got all of the people who are in the space of, I have to be on media. I have to be
Mhm.
engaged in this because it's going to impact my business. I need to be there. I need to be present in order to create visibility for myself and all of that sort of stuff. And my only invitation around this, and I'm only sharing what I've actually gone through in my own world, because this is the practical boots on the ground. How do I make this in my own world? Use a lot of the tools out there that allow you to schedule your stuff. If you're not using that, if you are always doing it live, I think that's a really easy step. And you can do that without spending a whole lot of money.
Mhm.
And I think what happened for me when I started tuning out of the mainstream chatter, that silence started to come in, right?
Mhm.
Um, that silence, those moments of silence um, and sort of an awareness started to come in. And when I say I started to layer things back in, it was actually in a much more divergent way. Like that's when I had a subscription to Gaia and I was like all consuming a whole bunch of different, really, really different stuff through Gaia. And it was really challenging me to consider, like, wow, okay, how have I been seeing things before? And this brings me back into the big picture stuff, right? So it
Mhm.
was practical steps. I cut my cable subscription. I literally unplugged from all of that and I stepped out of social media for quite a while. And I'm only now coming back into it. And I shouldn't say only now coming back into it, but I'm coming back into it and I'm using it on my own terms. I'm using
Mhm.
it on my own terms from both a professional perspective and a personal perspective. And what I'm doing may not work for anybody else. Probably it won't because they're not me.
Mhm.
But that I think is a really like back to this idea of trying to stay really practical in what did we do? How did we get here? And this pathway to sovereignty, to
Mhm.
remembering that we are sovereign souls, is not about these quantum leaps, although I think those happen, but
Yeah.
it's about taking one step and it's about shifting things 1 degree at a time.
Yeah.
And, maybe by listening to conversations like this about, oh, I never thought about doing that. That I could do that. I could totally do that. I could totally do
Mhm.
that. I could totally do Wednesdays and Sundays. Absolutely. Or or not, right? So, but all of it's awareness and learning. So,
Yeah.
okay. You talked a little bit about spiritual law, and it's funny because I just did a conversation with my on my Telegram group around the Hermetic tradition. And I think the spiritual laws that you were talking about that Chopra did carry the same sort of. grounding influence as the Hermetic principles did
Yeah.
for me. And so I'm really starting to invite people to really consider simple statements of fact. Simple statements of fact. And, our world doesn't like facts very much right now. They're more about the, you know, fear propaganda and shit. But
What's the
simple,
narrative?
it is the narrative. So simple statements of fact. And one of the things that I shared with my group this past week was the principle of correspondence, which of course you're going to be familiar with. But for those of you who are not, in very, very simple terms, it speaks about this idea of understanding the world through the lens of as within, so without. As within, so without. And this was, I think, what brings us back to understanding what Alli was saying about we it starts here. And if we're spending all of our energy out there trying to make sense of what, crazy clown show is unfolding in front of us out there, we're not here. And this right here, like all in here, is where we actually have the greatest amount of power.
Yeah.
So this as within, so without, um, has another kind of lens to it, I think, this idea of mm, whatever is, I wrote about this in my ebook, whatever is absent or present in here will be
Hmm.
absent or present out here. And
Oh, yeah.
it's this, Braden, Greg Braden talks about the holographic
Yeah.
universe. And so, at the risk of getting a little too down the woo woo rabbit hole, I think that's an interesting conversation to be able to not convince, but cause people, invite people to see the
Yeah.
value of coming back here again, being in our heart, thinking from our heart, being in an embodied state. So, your thoughts?
Oh, I love all that. I love how you've referenced either present or absent within the internal self. I think that's a beautiful way of depicting that. And I think the law or the principle of correspondence almost kind of links to the law of intention in a sense, because, and to bring this into more practical terms again, it's literally just starting by asking, how have I been and how do I choose to be? Like literally just looking at how have I been living my life? Am I enjoying this? Maybe there are certain aspects I am. Maybe there's certain pieces that are absent or that are missing. So, how am I going to choose to be now moving forward? And then also maybe asking, what does my heart require? Like, if something is absent, what do I require to start to connect with that piece in myself? Or how can I share more of that? So, there is a component of self reflection, I feel, that is happening here. But then it's also in conjunction to that, it's well, what needs to be addressed in my inner world? Like, what actually needs my love and attention now? And I think through all of this and asking, how have I been? How do I choose to be? What does my heart require? What needs to be addressed in my internal world is we're then looking to apply meaning. We're applying meaning to our lives. We're applying meaning to our actions, to our intentions. And it's not only about the doing, it's how am I choosing to be throughout all of this? And I think that's also part of this age of authenticity is yes, there's a doing that's required, but also understanding that once we establish a certain level of doing that we then create a momentum. And that when we then choose to, remain in that state, it's then also self-serving. There's not as much energy that's required to keep it going, if that makes sense. So I think it's a matter of really being okay to sit with ourselves and to also start to understand what it means to be emotionally intelligent. And I think it's really important to note, and I've been seeing this so much lately, and I'd love to know, Trish, if you've been noticing this, but I feel like I've had this conversation with a few people now where age doesn't always equal maturity. And sometimes we forget that,
Sorry, I don't
right?
mean to laugh that out loud. Sorry.
But it's a really important topic, I think, to address because emotional intelligence, spiritual maturity it's almost like we've learned how to pause, we've learned how to process, and we've then figured out a practice to serve us, or we figure out how do I want to practice living in this state of being. So the pausing, the processing, and the practicing. And I don't know, I feel like there's this, I mean, from the darkness must come out the light. And so I feel like there's a lot of people in their ego lately, a lot of people. And so I think there's just a really beautiful invitation to, of course, if you notice you're living in your ego, to not be judgmental of that, to befriend your ego and say, my ego is actually my personality. Really, at the end of the day, my personality is creating my personal reality. That's all Joe Dispenza talks about. So
Mm,
it's, am I going to live from this state of I need to prove to the world why I'm important, ego, or can I
mhm.
live from the soul level self and say, well, I'm important just because I'm here, but I also get to choose how to express myself throughout this experience. So it's like, I'm here now. So how can I best enjoy the human experience? So I feel like it's very much just linking to what you said about as within, so without. What's actually going on internally? Let me self reflect. Let me almost become the researcher of myself, and let me see what comes from that.
Oh my gosh. See, I honestly think that Allie and I could do this like every single week, and we would still not run out of things to talk about. Sorry to have interrupted your conversation when I laughed out loud
No,
about the
it's
whole
okay.
maturity thing, but honestly, I mean, I think that's, and maybe this is just where I am in my journey, but that has been, that's just so obvious to me now that,
Hmm.
there are individuals who are running around on this planet and they've been here for a long time and they don't have the the grounded that like a grounded ego, a grounded,
Hmm.
their egos are very ungrounded. And yet, like yesterday I spent most of the day with one of my 14-year-old nieces, and she's so grounded. She's so
Hmm.
grounded. I mean, yes, she's still playful and fun and 14 and a goofball, but she's got this very grounded energy about her. And, you know, like it's, to be able to, and we were in a mall, right? We were in a mall, right? Because that's where you go with 14-year-olds sometimes. But
Of course.
right? But you can walk through the mall, and I'm walking beside this individual who's got this really grounded energy, and you can have a real, honest conversation with her, and at the same time, I'm observing people in the mall who are easily 4 and 5 times her age, and I'm like, wow.
I
So that's
know.
really interesting. Like, what's that journey been like that there's still such an ungrounded ego in someone who's participated in life for that long? But that's why I laughed because it was so timely and so present moment for me. Um, mum, 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 you were talking about this idea of kind of back to this idea of going within
Yeah.
and maybe even taking a bit of an inventory for yourself, like where does my heart need X, where does what aspects of my life need Y. um,
Hmm.
and so I wanted to take a moment, and if you guys aren't familiar with this, I'm going to share this just very, very quickly so that you can get a screen grab of it, or so you know what to go and look for if you've not heard of Maslow's pyramid of needs. Um, because I think, again, in the spirit of making this a really practical conversation, bringing it back to the absolute everyday elements that we are kind of bumping up against. I think this for me, when I stepped out of in 2012, I went and started working on my psychology degree, not because I wanted a degree, but because I was really interested in psychology. And Maslow was one of the most influential theorists in psychology for me. And so he came up with this pyramid, and I think it's as true today as it was when he created it. And so this could be a really great starting place for that inner conversation that you're having about, okay, if I'm going to be really honest with myself, How am I feeling on a scale of 1 to 5 about my physiological needs? And right now, in this clown show that we're living in, there's a lot of things that are challenging the base of this pyramid, the base of this triangle. How am I doing with my safety needs? How am I doing with this sense of love and belonging? I think that the events that started to unfold back in, that March 2020 realm really went right to the very core of that love and belonging
Yeah.
tier on his pyramid. How am I doing about self esteem? How great do I feel about myself? How sovereign do I feel in my world? And then self actualization is obviously at the top because we don't have capacity for that unless all of the tiers below it are solid, are are
Mm.
really grounded, really grounded. And so I wanted to share that very quickly because I think that's an interesting place to just spend some time meditating. So if you're not going to be on your phone, like Alli's saying, like, can you just put that away? Maybe take that into the
Mhm.
bathroom with you instead.
Yeah,
Maybe take
honestly.
that on a walk with you if you're walking with your dog instead of your phone. Take Maslow's pyramid with you and spend some time thinking about that and really listening for what that voice, that quieter voice,
Mhm.
um, might be trying to sort of ping you with, like, hey, maybe I think we need to look at this. Maybe we need to spend some time focusing on this, and not from a place of it, and because it will, I think, and you get to weigh in on this, please. I know for me, there were periods over the last 10 or 12 years, and for sure over the last 4 or 5 years, where the only thing that was getting me through the day was in this micro moment, I am safe. I
Mm.
have everything that I need. I have people who love me. I have skills and talents and I am valuable because I exist and I am on my path in this micro moment. And I would
Yeah.
have to say that to myself sometimes like 100,000 times a day because what's going on out there is challenging us every single minute of the day to really consider, are we okay in this micro moment? In this
Yeah.
micro moment. And what happened for me is I was really using that as a mantra for myself, Alli. In
Yeah.
this micro moment, I am fill in the blank in a positive way, not in a negative way.
Yeah.
I have I have shelter. I have enough food. I have warm clothing. I had a good night's sleep, right? In this micro moment, that's what's true for me. I
Wow. I
have
love that.
resources. I have skills that can enable me to, go and create more if that's what is on my mind. And
Yeah.
um, and I'm going to make this even more simple for some because even Maslow's triangle or pyramid can be a little bit overwhelming. There was another thing that I came across is, um, look at your health, look at your wealth, and wealth being a lot of different things beyond just money, well-being, mindset,
Yeah.
mental, um, mental health as well as physical health, meaning and
Mhm.
love. So health, wealth, meaning, and love. Those were four other things that I was playing with at a certain point in my journey about,
Mm.
okay, how am I doing? How am I doing right
Yeah.
now? And can
Yeah.
I find a way to be really deeply honest with myself? I don't
Mm.
care about who else you talk about it to, but can I at least be honest with myself? And from a woo-woo perspective, I think we talked about this in January, that there's a lot of things moving from a planetary perspective, from an astrology perspective, from a human design perspective. Um, there's a lot of energy that's shifting right now that is really inviting us to get grounded and rooted and really start to lean into this conversation around
Mhm.
spirit, whatever that looks like for you.
Yeah.
One of my coaches way back in the day said, because I was in the battle, I was in the struggle of like, okay, well, is it this? This is what I grew up with. This is what I learned. but it doesn't
Yeah.
really feel right anymore. And then I went through the yoga years, and that made it a little bit more confusing. But she said to me, she said, I know, right? Like, very
Made it
different
more
worlds.
confusing.
Made it even more confusing. And then, anyways, yeah. She said, well, you didn't wake yourself up this morning. You didn't wake yourself up this morning. And then, of course, I got cheeky at times. I'm like, yeah, I know, my alarm did. Yeah, but your alarm didn't wake you up this morning either, right? You didn't wake yourself up this morning. Something else brought you back into that place of consciousness, that level of consciousness to step out into your day. And so I think that it's a place that we don't spend a lot of time in for the most part, right? Like the vast
Yeah.
majority of people, I think, acknowledge that yes, there's something, but what that is so individual, it's
Hmm.
so personal, and I think that could be a very anchoring um, experience for people right now, is to come back into asking the questions of like what is this about? Like what did create this all around me? What created me? And to start finding a different relationship with that starts to, I think, shift how you start looking at Maslow's pyramid, how you
Hmm.
start thinking about, can I tune out of the media? Can I shut that off for even a week? Can I shut it off for a week and trust that something else will provide for me what I need, will provide the information that I need, the sort of the maybe the updates that I feel like I need, right? Again, back to trying to blend this spiritual conversation with more of a material existence. What are your
Oh, I
thoughts on
think
that?
I think you've hit the nail on the head with that. And that's, I sometimes, and I may have even said this in our time together, and I know it's like not the best metaphor by any means, but I'll joke and say that Reiki is kind of like the gateway drug to spirituality because it does have that anchoring effect. For
Yeah.
myself, we grew up Ukrainian Catholic, but didn't talk about it. We didn't really talk about what that meant or really what God was, or we'd go to church a couple times a year and then that was really it. So growing up, I'd say, well, I'm Ukrainian Catholic, but I didn't know what that meant for me. And then when in 2018, I started to open up to the idea of something else, Reiki, and I said earlier, was the root of my sort of spiritual exploration because it gave me a tool. It gave
Mm-hmm.
me a tool to not only connect to myself, but also to connect to something more. And then I got to decide what is that something more for me. And again, not everybody's going to agree with me when I say this. This is my own personal perspective, but I feel like we're all connecting to the same something more. At the
I
end of the
agree.
day, it's the same infinite power. But because we have different cultural backgrounds, different upbringings, we have different beliefs, right? That we need different paths of getting there. We need a different story to help make sense of it. But ultimately, figuring out through language and experience what our something more is, having that word can be very, very helpful and very anchoring. So for myself, for the longest time, I was like, ooh, God, no, I'm going to start with universe. Like that feels better.
Yeah.
And that was my starting point. And now source and God are very sort of interchangeable for me. Because when I first started, I thought, well, God belongs to the religious world. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's I can't connect to that because I'm not really Ukrainian Catholic, I don't think anymore. So
Mm-hmm.
that's just for them. But that's baloney.
Mm-hmm.
God, the word and the sound God was here far before
Right.
any religions even came into being. I know that's kind of a sticky topic, and I'm not putting them down by any means. That's another story
No.
we need to connect.
Yeah.
But that's why I love spirituality because I can take pieces. I can take bits and pieces from maybe Buddhism. I connect with Jesus a lot through meditation. So, I connect with all these different pieces, but love and unity and compassion and joy are always at the root of my practice. And so, when it comes to spirituality, there's no rules aside from, I think, again, love being at the root of it and deciding what is my word, what feels good for me right now, and knowing that the word can change and shift and adjust to suit the expansion of your own journey. So I love that you spoke to that. I think that's really, really important right now as well, because it reminds us that we are never alone. We might feel lonely sometimes, but we are never alone. And when we link this whole sort of process of like the stillness, the allowance, the introspection, sort of harnessing the emotional intelligence, then we get to start leaning into our dharma and our purpose, because we go, okay, now I'm figuring out kind of who I am, what I'm connected to. I'm allowing myself to express. And actually, one piece that I wanted to add, linking to your Maslow's hierarchy of needs, is that I was doing a workshop the other day for a group of teachers, and we were talking about boundaries and children, and how there are basic needs and then there are the want-based demands, and how we can sort of show up differently on both of those, right? But the basic needs we always need to ensure that we are providing those to a child, regardless of what mood we're in. But what I
Yeah.
thought was interesting, and I forget what I was reading, what research that I found this in, but expression is actually part of our basic needs. Expression is part of that. And I was listening to, again, something else when I did have my moment on the socials. And I thought it was interesting because I've never actually linked it this way. We talk about public speaking being one of the biggest fears in all of humanity. And the gentleman was talking about the throat chakra. And he's like, well, if we weren't taught how to express ourselves or given permission to express ourselves at a very early age, then no wonder we all have this absolute fear of
Mm.
authentically showing up, because this is linked to authenticity.
Yeah.
So I thought that was a very interesting perspective. And also, when we do start to explore and anchor into our spiritual connection, we're also working to expand our capacity. Because here's the thing, yes, we all have infinite potential. We absolutely do. But we generally have a certain capacity that we're working with, right? Based on the lives that we've lived. So when we start to go through all of this and start anchoring into self, we start to expand that capacity. So then we have greater access to the infinite.
Yeah.
It's always
Yeah.
there, but sometimes we might feel like we're limited because of our beliefs or because of what we were raised to come to see the world as. So again, it's linking back to the very beginning of our conversation, that we get to choose how all of this looks. So that's my little piece on that.
Yeah, and I think for those of you who are like, yeah, yeah, choice, sure, that sounds great. But really quietly you're like, I'm terrified of choosing. I'm terrified
Mhm.
of choosing because there's so if I get to choose, if I am, in the purest sense of what a lot of spiritualists talk about, that you choose your reality, that both sucks as well as it is completely empowering, and at the same time it can feel overwhelming. If I
But we
could
have to
choose
be
anything.
ready. We have to be
Yeah.
ready to take
We have to
responsibility.
be ready for that. And I think that's where, we're in this place of being invited to root and ground into, some things that are really fundamental to being both human on the planet as well as spiritual in nature, right? That spiritual nature that we have in the human element. I don't think it's meant to be either or. I think it's the beauty of it is the integration of both. And when you were talking about how many different um, ways or concepts a person could carry, this idea of what spirituality is, or the role or how religion fits into it, how spiritual traditions or the sacred texts, how all of that sort of weaves itself, and how do we even make sense of how many there are. I think the diversity is part of the equation.
Hmm.
Diversity is part of the equation.
Yeah.
I just, you look around the world, and nature in and of itself is just so diverse. Why
Mm.
wouldn't the the spiritual elements, the way that God, source, spirit, the divine, whatever language you want to use, why wouldn't the way they showed up in showing themselves be as diverse as what we see in nature? It makes complete sense to me, and I think it is our privilege to be able to walk through that and and feel what resonates for us, feel where we really connect with some aspect or multiple aspects, or finding our own way. I love also that you talked about the throat chakra, because and this self-expression, and because it's one of the things that I talk about with my clients from a communication standpoint,
Mhm.
is, and it comes back to being really rooted and grounded in the knowledge that we are valuable because we exist. We
Mhm.
have a unique value to bring into the marketplace if you're a business owner, or even if you're an employee for someone. There's something
Yeah.
that you're able to do that no one else can do. And you kind of loop it back into the spiritual conversation and the Christian tradition, which is where I grew up into. God spoke the world into existence.
Hmm.
God spoke it, let there be light. It was words that created that connection. And so of course I think it makes sense for us to be able to find our voice,
Hmm.
find our voice and really feel very comfortable with our voice. And that takes time, especially depending on, where we've been in our journey and what experiences we've had. So, and of course, what's woven into all of our, crazy soul insights that we talk about all the time. So, we are at about the 1 hour mark, and I do want to hold ourselves to, this is the longest conversations that I ever do, is when I do like one-to-ones with people like this. But I truly hope that this was of value to you. I hope that there was, maybe one or maybe multiple moments where you had something kind of land for you, or it's given you a way to redirect yourself towards a more expansive experience in the midst of the crazy clown show going on. Alli, is there anything that you would like to leave us with today?
You know what? I think just one last question for self-introspection, just to kind of link all of this together. And you really kind of alluded to it just now, which I think is just like a perfect intro. And it's really, how can my soul, through its most authentic expression, serve the souls of others?
Mm,
And I think that's going to really help to kind of anchor this in for those listening as well, to go, okay, now that I've maybe explored the stillness, I've maybe start to look at where I've been, where I'd like to go. Now I get to really curiously explore. Now I get to be brave. Now I get to be courageous. And now I get to lean into my interest, my passions, my talents, and also maybe cultivate that which I'm not good at now, but I know that I can, that I can step into that. So yeah, how can we be of service through our authentic soulful expression?
yeah, I love that. I love that. And, if I were to tie that back to the astrology piece, we all have, Virgo is very much about this idea of how can we be of service to society. Um, and we all have Virgo somewhere in our charts. We all have all of the charts, and we all have Virgo. It doesn't mean you don't have to have a huge, like, Virgo sun or Virgo rising. We all have this component somewhere within us, and I do think that there is an invitation for us to, once we get grounded in our own sense of self and self-worth, self-value, to find out how we want to bring that forward in a very authentic and um, balanced balanced way. Balanced way. So thank you again for joining us. I am back in April. It'll be the last Tuesday of April for Soul Talk again, and I think I will see Alli back in a couple of months. I have to look at our schedule and figure out when that works to bring her back. But you can expect to see her. She's going to be a regular, showing up for conversations just like this one, where we're kind of playing on both sides of this big picture, practical action.
Thank you.